At some point in your woodworking journey, you are going to toy around with the idea of changing the thickness of your workpieces, or perhaps even buying rough lumber and needing to clean it up. Now to do that, there's one machine and or one hand tool that are absolutely essential, some kind of planer, hand plane or machine powered planer to remove material in a relatively quick manner that we can make two sides parallel to one another. Okay, straightforward. There are two types of people. People who get into a new task, buy a new tool with doing tons of research, they know going in everything. And there are people like me who we learned enough to get from point A to point B, and then we kind of just open the door and stumble in and we make some mistakes, get frustrated, whatever, and we head and we go do the research we could have done initially. I'm here to try to make sure you get the research done initially in a relatively concise manner so that you're not stumbling through the door like I am. And when it comes to planing, and woodworking in general, but very specifically planing, grain direction is extremely important. If we get this wrong, it can sometimes be project ruining depending upon how much material we have left to remove. When we refer to the grain, we're essentially talking about the orientation of the fibers that run through the tree as it grows. In a perfect world, we would get these in a nice, controlled, straight grain manner. Not always the best looking, but by far the most stable and easy to deal with. There are 4 or 5 different types of grain kind of growing patterns, some much more problematic than the others. But all we need to know is that no matter what it is, we can improve our outcome based on reading the grain correctly and then feeding into the tools directly. And again, we're going to focus mainly on the planer here because it's so noticeable if you get it wrong on the planer or with the hand plane. Now, a lot of times you've got a planer and you want to venture into rough lumber, but it comes extremely rough. A lot of the times there's this kind of fuzzy edge on the end and you can't see the grain at all. And to read the grain direction, we generally want to be able to look at the edge of a board. Obviously, depending upon the saw orientation when they're milling it, any face can be any edge, but the way we read it for using the planer and hand planing, we need to see the edge of the board to find the direction the grain is going to give ourselves the best chance of having the smoothest material removal, the least amount of tear out, and then there's a few other things for other tools as well. Now in general, we talk about going along the grain, with the grain, or across the grain. Going along or with the grain would be going down the board the long ways, across the grain going this way, hence cross cut. And therefore, when we're talking about planing, we're going down the long ways. We're going with the grain, we're feeding the board in this way. We're not going in like that. So for this, we're going to focus on going with the grain. So the first thing you need to do before you do any planing, anything like that, is find out which way this grain is going. I like to do it with a hand plane and this little thing that Rex Kruger I saw on a short. It's really useful if you don't have a vise. I have for years put off buying a vise because that bench is too tall and this one's too short because it had to match my table saw. So I have another alternative method. But we don't need this to be straight. We don't need any of that. We just need to be able to see under all that fuzz. You can do this with any board you get that has anything covering it where you can't see the board. We don't always have to do the whole thing. If it's really long, we just need a good section of it or even possibly both ends, but we'd like to be able to see the whole thing because we need to see what that grain looks like in relation to that board. Now, once we've got enough removed that we can see the vast majority of the board, we're going to take it around and we're going to look at this. Now, each of these is going to be a side and the grain is going to be relative to the side. This is going to tell us which side we're going up and therefore which direction that upside is going. So let's come in a little closer and we'll look at the grain of this board. We can talk about what going with the grain means. Now for reference here, I have a piece of nagao. This is some quilted maple. And you can see on the nagao, we've got this very, very obvious, nice kind of upward swoop. So this is side A, and therefore the grain on this left side swoops up for side A. On this quilted maple, however, we've got some ups and downs and all over the place. We're kind of starting a little down here, and then we're up and then down. We're just all over the place. But we can look along it and say, where is the majority of this going? And in my opinion, the majority of this is ending up going swooping up towards this way. We don't have to have it perfect like on this, even though that's really nice. But I'm seeing low points kind of here relative to high points down here. And there's a little high point here, but if you think about it, if I were to chop just that little inch off, this would be low relative to high. So that's how I'm going to read that, meaning for this side, our grain is running swooping up that way. So we've identified our direction on both of these boards, and we are now going to do something that you have to remember. Even when you're planing a ton of boards, it can be easy to get confused. I like to label things. We want to feed into the machine such that the swooping is at the back end. We're going in as if we are swooping up. That is always the most important thing. Now, that is not to say that every board is nice and clean throughout and that it will be perfect across the whole thing. In fact, sometimes the cooler the grain look, the worse it is. We get some interlocked, wavy, all kinds of different stuff. But every board has a better direction than the other direction. So sometimes you do have to flip them around, but we can generally get a pretty good idea for that first pass or two which way we'd like to go. Maybe we're wrong, so be it. We go both ways if need to. But in this board right here where we have this clear swooping up towards the back, I want to feed in back here, entrance here, going in. That planer wants to cut up. It wants to almost scoop out. And the reason we want this is if we think about those fibers on the grain, they're kind of laying together like this. We want these back fibers supported. So every time it scoops, the fiber after it is angled up and supporting it. If we were to go the other way, and you can notice this with like a chisel, if you go the wrong direction, it can scoop up and just chunk out an entire piece. And it can be project ruining sometimes. It can be awful. It can happen with the planer too if you take too deep of a cut. We always want to try to have the most fibers supported. Like I said, it's not possible on every board to get a perfect direction for the entire width of the board, but we can generally get a good direction for most of it. So whenever you're feeding into a tool, just always picture back to the planer, because we have things like the jointer where the cutter is now on the bottom and we're going on the top and going over the jointer. But if we picture that as if it's almost an upside down jointer, we can then just in our head flip around which way we're going or visualize it being turned upside down, and then we can go in that same way and we follow the grain the same way. We have to think about where the cutter is in relation to the board. A table saw, for instance, if you've ever got a table saw cut and sometimes you get a little fuzziness on the outside, it's just not nice and shiny. Could be a dull or dirty blade, but sometimes it's because you're going in the wrong direction of the grain, or there are some pockets of grain where it's very, very chaotic due to interlocking, something like that. But that's a good example of a non-planar jointer tool where you get some problems if you go the wrong direction. You can always try flipping it over again. Sometimes you can't escape it, and part of the edge is not going to be perfect. Always make sure your blades are sharp though, that's definitely going to help. So now that we've established that we want to go with the grain, we want to enter with the swoosh coming up, almost like a golf swing. We want our exit of the swing to be the back piece of the board going in, right? Fair enough. Well, sometimes we get these heavily figured boards that have grain going all the way around. It doesn't always work. You feed it straight in, even if you're going the right way. You've tried both ways. One is definitely better. We're still getting some problems. Well, how do we approach that? We approach it, one, with reasonable expectations that maybe our blades aren't super sharp and we're never going to get it perfect, but we can also approach it from the way the engineers did. If you've heard of the helix or the helical head, you'll understand that it's not a spiral head, it's a helical because it angles the cutter slightly to go into the wood and to shear at an angle rather than slicing and scooping up. Well, on our normal planer, we have straight knives, normal jointer straight knives or a spiral head. We can't, what are we going to spend $500? Get real. But we can change the orientation of the wood, right? The planer doesn't know that it's not at an angle. If we plane at a slight angle, roughly the similar degree of the helix head or any of the helical heads, we can sort of trick that planer into shearing across the board, and you get limited by width of a board and length. We can't put a giant board in at an absurd angle, but we can go generally in a pretty good angle. And as a bonus, we minimize snipe. So if you've got a heavily figured board with some twisted, interlocked, crazy grain, and you can't get one way to be significantly better than the other, pick the best way and then tilt that thing at an angle. And that will help support the fibers because we are going the way with the majority of the grain, and then that shearing will be coming across the fiber. If you're ever hand planing and you're having problems, you'll notice one direction, you can just chunk that thing out of there. You can tilt it a little bit. Just go at an angle. In fact, most people don't perfectly go in a straight line, right? They don't actually go perfectly down the center. Most people cant the plane a little bit, even if it's just a slight angle off to the side. And this gives us a bit of a shearing action rather than just that straight scooping down there, slicing, whatever you want to call it. I think of it like a scoop because really on the machine planer, that's what it's doing. It's scooping and slicing. Now, grain direction can come into play with other things like tear out, right? If you've ever had a router and you're doing some kind of like plunge cut into a piece of wood and you end up going across the grain, let's say you're cutting a mortise on the face and you want it to be this direction. If you're not using the right bit or even with the right bit, you'll notice it's a much rougher cut on the side than if we go down the middle. It also is harder to move through that because we are trying to cut the fibers rather than kind of sever them down the middle. If you're on the table saw and you're cross cutting, again, going across the fibers, you often get the tear out on the exit side because that fiber is not supported, whereas with the rip cut, generally, we get a pretty clean exit. We don't have to worry about that so much because we're going with the fiber. Now, I was doing a little hand planing of this earlier to try and find a board where I went the wrong direction and could easily see it. And I'm hoping you can see here these little pulling ups of these tabs. I was planing in this way and I was clearly going the wrong direction. And as you can see, it just rips these little things up and it wants to pull that fiber off like that. Now, if I go the other way, I can't get that thing. I can't pull it out because the fibers behind it are supporting it. So if you are ever planing something and something just isn't right, obviously if you have really dull blades, that's going to be a problem in its own right, but consider flipping it around the other direction. And with any tool you use that has any kind of spinning cutter that's going in a certain direction, you know, bandsaw blade's not going to really matter for that. Consider trying an alternate direction if you are having problems with any sort of fuzziness on the edge or any kind of extreme tear out where you can go a different direction. Sometimes we can't always do that, but I just found that with planing wood, that was a game changer for me to learn that there is a certain direction. It greatly improved my results. Now, one thing I want to add at the end here is that grain and figure are not the same thing. But if you go the wrong direction on a heavily figured board, it gets even worse and you can just get some totally chunking out. Sometimes, like I mentioned earlier, we have these things called interlocked grain where during the growth of the tree, it's not in a nice straight line. It's not even in a nice kind of wavy line. Some of it's going this way, some of it's going that way. And you end up almost with these little kind of spiral looking bits of grain. Beautiful looking. Horrible for having to work with because it doesn't want to support in any given direction. It's all over the place. Those are absolutely, in my opinion, the most problematic. I had a piece of Chechen once and absolutely gorgeous. It was so gorgeous. I would have used that wood forever if it didn't have relatively common interlocked grain within it. It's also stupid dense, but you know, that's acceptable. I can deal with that. But trying to plane that thing, I had to put a kind of second set of brand new knives in just to plane that because the grain was so interlocked that no matter what I was doing with the knives that were still fine for other American hardwoods, but not this dense exotic with interlocked grain, that got me through the project. I worked a couple more projects with it and that was it. I was done. I can't afford to replace knives all the time just to deal with interlocked grain. I want to show you an example of the chisel. I've got an interesting piece of pine here. Well, interesting not really, but in the sense that we've got this swoop going both ways. And as I chisel this, there is a different performance from here and here based on which direction I'm going. On this side here, we'd obviously like to be going this way from this side over and then going that way from this side over. But of course, that's kind of hard to do unless you come at it from both angles. We'll see if we can hear and just see how much rougher it is when we're going the wrong way. You can see how it just wants to dig in there. It doesn't want to shave nicely, whereas if I come over here, I can get these really kind of consistent shavings. And then conversely, we can go the wrong way here, and you can just see how much more it wants to just dig in there. And then we go over here, and we get that incredibly smooth chiseling again because we're going the correct direction this way. Obviously, this presents some problems if you're trying to do any pairing because what are you going to do, go two different ways to try to maintain that? But there it is. You can see it starts to dig right in there as I make this transition. So just something to think about that when you're chiseling or doing anything. If you can go the correct way with the grain and go into the swoop, it's always going to be easier and have better results, and you're going to be less likely to have that kind of digging in where then the thing just spirals out of control. One more area of woodworking where you have to pay at least a little attention to the grain direction is sanding. If you are only using a random orbit sander, be thankful we live in this time because these take away a lot of the problems. Due to the orbiting and the randomness of it, it's never like we're dragging straight across the grain. If you wanted, you could generally get a project pretty well sanded just going back and forth. You're not going to leave anywhere near as many scratches. However, a lot of times there is some amount of hand sanding required, whether it's a small space or you just want to do it by hand or a really high grit where these pads get really expensive. And in that case, we do definitely need to pay attention to the grain here. If we go across the grain, especially on something like this where there is nice straight grain, it is going to be extremely noticeable. You will leave very deep scratches, and heaven forbid you try to stain it afterwards. It'll just be atrocious. You can't even sell it as rustic at that point. It's just really bad. So we want to generally follow the grain along. Okay, that's relatively easy on certain boards, but what about the end grain? And what about on boards that just have this pretty wild kind of wavy grain? Well, if you tried doing it before, you'll probably notice that it's still kind of apparent. Now with end grain, one thing I've found over the years, and yes, this is time consuming, and I would suggest only doing it on pieces that you're either going to sell or are very important, is I will sit there, I will take my sandpaper, every single grit, and I will follow those lines across, and you'd be stunned. The sanding scratches just disappear once you get into 240 and up. If you follow those lines, even if they're a little all over the place, they will disappear, and it is worth it, in my opinion, on those special pieces to take that extra time. And of course, we have pieces like this where the grain is just, it's all over the place. It's crazy. It's wild. We can't just go back and forth and get it as good as we can with something like this with somewhat straight grain. These, you will notice the scratches, and we can hide them somewhat. Again, I like to go up to maybe 320 with random orbit sanding, but that's not as far as I like to go. I like to get a polish on there with 400 and then quadruple aught steel wool, meaning I have to do some hand sanding after I do this. This will make it nice and clean and everything like that, but I don't get the luster that I really want. I get out the 400 grit and I take the time to quite literally follow this along, roughly. I'm not sitting there with a microscope, but we've got this wave going through there like that, and I will just kind of roughly follow that along. Sometimes you get these big swoops in and out. If it's a special project and you're doing those final finishing grits by hand, consider taking that extra time to just follow that grain line a little bit, and it will disappear so much better than if you just sit there kind of rubbing away at it. It'll be okay if you do that, but it won't be as good as it could be. And for certain projects, we want to have it as good as possible. If you have any questions, let me know. And if you have anything to add, certainly add that below. All right, thanks for joining me today. Bye. Oh, and subscribe or don't. You're an adult, you'll figure it out.